So we're 2 games into the She Believes Cup. We got a win, we got a loss, and there's a lot to kind of take in. But there's so much uncertainty with the women's team right now, rightfully so for what they are pushing and fighting for. This could be the last time we see them on the pitch, unless something is resolved. We're probably definitely not seeing them at home, and we may not see them on the pitch until the World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. So if we're assessing this, it kind of does suck, and you get the idea of having larger camps here because there's a bit of a twofold thing with this. So welcome to the Africans, making Canadian African content. This is Canadian, clearly. Looking at a breakdown of the team, this isn't a who makes the plane 23. This is more of a what are the options, what are the depth chart, what are the players we've been pulling, and where it is going. And we're starting this in the midfield because I think the midfield is the most interesting. That's probably the more interesting aspect. A lot of this depends on whether or not FIFA does move its roster limit here, whether it stays at 23, 24, maybe it should go up to 26, which I think it should. Especially if you're looking at what's been going in women's football with the rash of injuries, soft tissue injuries happening, the ACL. 2022 was snatching ACLs like it was nobody's business, and players are still looking to return, so we'll see what they're able to do. But the midfield is an intriguing conversation on the women's side. Now, again, with all the uncertainty that's going on there, let's assume this is the last time we've seen this team play. And again, these are my opinions here. This isn't anyone else here, so feel free to comment down below if you agree, disagree, maybe have different conversations. We go from there. The main talking point when it comes to the midfield is essentially the starting 3. Now, we've seen one starting 3 in 3 of the last 8 matchups coming through, and it's been a double holding of Fleming and Grosso, with Sinclair as your 10, typically in a 4-2-3-1 setup and moving forward. Now, we've seen it in one game against the first game in Australia. We saw it the first game in Brazil versus Brazil, and then we saw it against the US. Now, there are some adjustments within all those games of things that have happened. You haven't had the same overall personnel, but the first question is the midfield a problem? And I think it's worth having a discussion about. However, I think the answer is a little bit more found in the idea of what are the matchups that they work with. If Canada is going to play a certain style, I think those midfielders work. I certainly do agree. I think if you're going to play that type of a style, you're going to try to do something that works. We saw that against Australia. Now, the key thing with the Australian matchup, which was that first matchup, which was the everyone's hurt, we're going to do this. This is the first time we saw the attacking quartet up there was Haidema at the 9, with Sink as the 10, and then you had Leon and Prince on your wings, and then your 2 holding midfielders were Grosso and Fleming. Now, what works with that is you have to have an outlet. And I think that's the thing we kind of do miss, essentially. And you kind of did see it a little bit with the Brazil game, even though you didn't have the same setup. I think you need outlets and you need pace for that to work. Now, against Australia, where they're trying to play more direct, trying to feed Sam Kerr the ball, and trying to get opportunities to do so, I think that type of a game, you're going to play more of an up and down, open type game. I think in that case, that midfield trio works. I truly believe that. I think if you think there is a defense, then the question becomes, who do you put in, right? Is it Desi? Is it Quinn? Is it Schmidt? Depends how they profile. I think Quinn and Schmidt, not Quinn and Schmidt, I believe Quinn and Scott are closer to your 6 destroyer types, solid defensively, giving you some support. And those are probably the options that are there. and that probably means you go more to one of those two players. If it was up to me, I think probably Quinn is the player. I think they have the profile, and in terms of progressing, nothing against Scott. Desi's been a great player for the program, a great player throughout her time here, but I feel that right now, Quinn is the player. I think they are the player that really can progress, not only be solid defensively, but also progress the ball to the attacking midfielders or find the outlets on the wing that work. The other thing with the US game, which I think is very important to note, yes, this is the second time we've played the US in less than a year. And I think the one factor is you need a little bit of pace on there. The US has pace, don't get me wrong, but I think not having a player like Prince or even Deanne Rose, I think it hurts that midfield in terms of finding outlets and finding players with pace who can maybe stretch out the defense, who've come up a bit too much, and exploit the space behind them. And that ultimately makes your midfield look good because you can spot a player in a one-on-one race. Yeah, I'll take Rose, I'll take Prince, no doubt. I'll even take Lacasse. But if you don't have those outlets, then you're trying to find balls, you're trying to move it around, your spacing is off. Now you're stuck in a situation where now you're pinned back. So I think it is a little bit matchup derived. It's not necessarily you have to go one way. And I think with the matchups that they have, we've seen this look good against Australia. We haven't seen this against a Nigeria type squad. I think this midfield trio will work in the World Cup, but I think only in the group stage. I think it can work against the group stage just from the standpoint, I don't think there's a lot attacking in that group. Canada with the group with Australia, the Republic of Ireland, and Nigeria. I think they can get away with playing that midfield trio. And then bringing in a player like Quinn when you're probably into the second half, trying to put the game away in that sense. So I think that works. I think that would really work. But the Republic of Ireland is still a solid defensive team, so having offensive players there that can really push and break through lines, that's not a bad idea to have. Now when it comes to depth in the midfield, who's your first midfielder off the bench? And let's be clear, I'm not married to the idea that those three have to start all the time. I think you can get away. I think it won't hurt you in the group stage at the World Cup. Personally. Because most of the teams against Canada will sit back. Probably in that group, only Australia will play, and they'll try to play direct. They'll try to play direct to Sam Kerr. So if that's the case, you're either giving Kerr the ball or you're trying to create. So midfield-wise, you can create, and we saw in their matchup, there was space to exploit. Now, they'll clearly clean that up. There's no doubt. But I think there was space to exploit, and there are two matchups in Australia where Prince took advantage of, Laracy took advantage of, Wusho took advantage of, Leon took advantage of, and then also within the pressure they were putting on, both Grosso, both Fleming, those two players along with Sinclair were able to space off, and Heidemann did a good job. Like Loki, she did a good job of pressuring the back line, occupying the center backs, doing things. But again, this is about the midfielders. So I'm not married to the idea, but I think it's fine. I think the matchup matters. But then the low-key thing with that matchup is you need proper outlets on the wing. And I think against Brazil, if you look at that game, they had a little bit better of it. But I think if you give outlets on the wings a little bit more pace, and this is where I think this team misses both Jade Riviere as well as Nichelle Prince. If you give some of those outlets, whether at fullback or on the wings, some pace, ultimately it makes your job a little bit easier, because instead of having to find a player, you can put the ball in space and let a player with a little bit of pace take advantage of that space and create mismatches and opportunities. So when it comes to the midfielders, who's the next midfielder off the bench? I think it's Quinn. Like I said, they give solid defensive work at all range. They've been playing really well. I think they would be the next person onto the pitch. And I think that makes sense. After Quinn, working under the assumption that we're just taking the 23. which means at the end of the roster, you're having a conversation between Desi and Simi Awujo. And that's going to be a conversation. Oof. But after Quinn, I think it's Sophie Schmidt. Sophie Schmidt is probably close to that box-to-box 8 that can still provide, coming off a great season in the NWSL. A really good season, looking really good. And I think if she can continue that into the beginning of her NWSL season, find some form, I think having that midfield will be great. So I think those are those 5. That's probably your combination of midfielders. Then you're down to 6. And I think there we go with the conversation. It's Desi or Simi. Now, this is where I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself a little bit. I think if you bring in a Desi, you don't start Sinclair. If you bring Desi in to the squad, which I think most people would assume she makes the squad, I think you don't start Sinclair. Because then your bench is essentially 2 6s and an 8. Right? And yes, they've played further up the pitch, of course. But you're looking at 2 6s and an 8 on your bench in the midfield. Which means any movement you make off that, you need to have a little bit more creativity and IQ. And those players have the IQ, don't get me wrong. But you need a little bit more offensive prowess on your bench. And in that case, then you put Sinclair on the bench and then you put Quinn in the starting lineup, in my opinion. If you do something like that, you play Quinn, you play them with Fleming, and then put Grosso in the advanced role. Now, if you bring Simi, if Bev chooses Simi over a player like Desi, Simi over Desi, then you can start Sinclair, because then it's just a matter of massaging and moving players around. You can bring in Simi for Sink, or you can bring any of the players in for Sinclair at a point, and then you just simply move one of the midfielders further up on the pitch. And that makes it a lot more reasonable, a lot easier to move. I think those are the conversations to have, right? I think watching this Japan game that's coming up on Wednesday is probably going to be my referendum on the idea of this midfield. I'll probably feel a lot more pro or against the trio of Grosso, Fleming, and Sinclair. Whether or not they play, I know Fleming came off with an injury. I haven't looked to see if it's a report. If I'm going to use my 0 years as a sports medicine person, it looked like a very rough thigh contusion, a really bad bruise, and hopefully she recovers. But I think there's nothing you need to see from Fleming. Right? If you're ranking in terms of midfielders playing, Fleming is in the starting 11. We don't need to have this conversation. So I don't think you need to see anything from her necessarily. I think it really does come down to some of the battles at the end of the roster, and you have to see them. We'll talk a little bit more after the Japan matchup, and we'll go to another group on the pitch. Players who I think, before we do wrap this up, players who I think who are just on the outside and are on that emergency standby call. I think Victoria Pickett's there. It's unfortunate because of reasons. We couldn't see her part of this camp, this roster overall. I would have loved to see her in this matchup here, to play against teams and play at the level. She plays at the NWSL, so you know she's at a decent to good level. It would have been nice to see her part of the national setup and see what she's able to do in terms of teams, in terms of rosters and what she can do. I think Sarah Stratigakis is further down on the roster than we realized in the October window when she came in to replace Sinclair, because Sinclair wasn't able to play. She didn't see the pitch, which to me means that I have to read the coach in that sense. So to me, that means I think Stratigakis is a little bit lower on the depth chart, especially with a player like Simi Awujo emerging. Zoe Burns I think they could look to bring her in potentially. I don't think that they will. They may just let her play out her collegiate year and then see what comes of it afterwards. But in terms of the midfielders called in, I mean, I think that's where it is. Simi and Desi, I think, are fighting for that last spot. And it really does come down to what do you need. I think ultimately Desi wins out. And that means that's where you're at. It is unfortunate. Other players were called in. We had Yasmin Alidou, who was called in June last year. I think she's further down the depth chart, unfortunately. I wish we could have seen more, but I mean, this goes to the whole conversation of having camps to see more players. That's a whole conversation also. But I think right now, if we're gonna make this as a makeshift, who's on the plane, who's got a go bag ready, I think 5 out of the 6 spots are set. Arguably, you can say 6 out of the 6 spots are set. I think Simi can do a lot to guarantee her spot on this roster. We'll see if she's able to do it. But right now, I think Fleming, Schmidt, Sinclair, Quinn, Grosso, their bags are packed. They're on the plane. The question is, what does Bev do in terms of numbers? I think she can be more creative around the wingers and fullbacks and have some players be able to cover multiple spots. But I think right now it's coming down to Rougeau versus Scott, and if you're really curious, Victoria Pickett might be able to crack it depending. I think it does also come down to, I think Bev does want to bring 2 solid defensive midfielders, unless she tries to be clever and use one of her center backs in the midfield. To do so, though, you would have to, again, take up from a position, subtract from a position and another one. Who is that extra defender you bring in? Is it Sorayeka that you have come in and play? Is it what other center backs do you have to play with? Odds are, I think that's what it comes down to. That's my thoughts on midfield, guys. Let me know in the comments how you feel. If you follow Canada, if you don't know, what do you think? I think, to recap real quick, I think the trio is fine. It depends on the matchup. I think if you know you're going to have a team that's going to push back a bit, you have to sacrifice one player, and more than likely that player is going to be Sinclair. And then have Sinclair as a super sub. I think that is probably where she is in her career. I don't think she necessarily can start. If she does start, it'll be a little bit like the Olympics, going maybe 50, 60 minutes and then subbing out and bringing in another player. But because she's in the midfield, maybe you're better off getting 30 minutes from her at the end versus 60 minutes from start to finish. We'll definitely see. But yeah, a little bit of depth chart, a little bit of things. I'm going to stop rambling now. But y'all, jump in the comments. Let me know what y'all think.